Alright, so welcome to Nuke 102. I am sorry that I disappeared there for a while. A lot of people have been asking for this training video follow-up to my first one since I got a lot of feedback on it. I've been very busy doing VFX supervision on feature films, and I currently am possibly going to be working for, in the future, hopefully, we'll keep our fingers crossed, with Framestore in Chicago. I was on hold to do a gig, but it fell through at the last minute due to the fact that I don't think they might have not had enough staff to take care of the job, so they moved it to their LA and New York office. So the good news is they're starting to build up their group there, and we're actually in the works of trying to get the Foundry user group meetup, which I direct for the Chicagoland area, actually hosted at their studio. So Chicago is really starting to kick butt. I got a lot of students working at different studios out here. You got the Wachowskis with their studio Kineworks, and you got the Mill, and you got Method, and there's just so many different studios popping up in Chicago. I'm assuming for tax breaks, I'm not sure why, but it's finally starting to become, all my life I've lived in Chicago, and it's always been that island that people have flown over from LA to New York, and I'm always like looking at the planes going back and forth going, is there anybody up there that is, from Hollywood that wants to do compositing? We exist. So it's been pretty cool to see Hollywood is like outreaching to other areas, like Louisiana. There's a film that I might be VFX supervising out there. And it's just, it's starting to expand across the U.S. And of course, it's moving into Canada, and it's also being outsourced. So I don't know what else to say in that regards. But for those of you around the world that have been kind of interested in my first tutorial, I want to do a tutorial that is the Uber tutorial. I'm talking about super advanced keyers that are being used by industry standard folks. I'm not talking about a couple of interesting little techniques. I'm not talking about like, oh, you might want to try this, might try that. I'm talking about actually starting with an Uber template for actually doing heavy, intense keying work, which is a lot of meat and potatoes of what compositing can be, a lot of green screen, blue screen work. And I wanted to have one that just takes all the stuff that I have learned from all over the place, from people that have worked on Star Wars to people that have worked in major commercials and the major commercials that I've worked on, just to have it all together for you folks to learn the best and easiest way possible. So what I went ahead and did was I went ahead and shot some stuff on the Blackmagic 4K camera here, and this stuff is included for free. Everything is for free on here to download off of my website. Obviously, we're going to have we're going to involve actual plugins here that are being used in the industry, because what I see a lot of these tutorials out there is they're using the default Nuke plugins, which you can strip down to actual gizmos into a whole bunch of nodes, but sometimes it's just best to use these awesome gizmos that you get off of Nukepedia and so forth. So obviously those are I don't own those, so that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of doing this for free. And I also want you to help me, if you can, support the website so I can continue to punch out more materials by supporting my actual charged videos if possible. So with that all said, let's go ahead and just jump in and look at some of this footage. This was shot on the Blackmagic 4K camera, which is RAW, so you can see it's 4K footage here, or quasi 4K, whatever you want to call it. So here you can see, here's my friend Jack, and I'll just go ahead and play through some of this footage here. And you can see Jack has been foreground lit with kind of a very bright, because we're going to have a sun right behind him, like a sunset. Right here, and he's got a little bit of blue lighting coming in as a fill. So it's a really intense reality. We lit the actual green screen in the back with 2 huge floodlights, and we lit the foreground with tungsten lights. So what you have here is a separation between what is being lit for the background, which is very flood lighting, and then in the foreground, which is a sort of a 3-point light setup or 2-point light setup with sort of like an orange light in the back and to the left, and then a blue light into the sort of like frontal lighting. So kind of simulating somewhat of that kind of reality when you get twilight / sunset, where you have like blue in the shadows and so forth. So it's not exactly like, beginning of sunset, but at the bottom end of sunset, so to speak. You'll notice that the color temperature is a little weird here. You can see this is a very bright green screen, and the color may not be correct. So if I go ahead and hold down Shift and Control and drag out this area here, you can see the values here, in the red and the green here. And the good news about RAW is we can adjust the color temperature here. So you can see as shot, I was somewhere around 3500 But we're mixing different types of tungsten with fluorescence and so forth, so it's getting kind of tricky to kind of balance this out. And one of the ways you can do that is you can kind of take the footage, and by the way, the exposure is way too high, so I'm going to start to crank that down a little bit. You can see the values here start to go down in the green, so you can see here, because I have this sample locked, this here, the value is kind of going up and down, right? So here we're at 6. And then if I adjust the temperature, obviously if we move this direction, things are going to get a lot warmer, right? So I'll go ahead and push it, or cooler I should say. And then over here we push this, things are going to get warmer. So as you can see, as I kind of push this back and forth, you can see the balance between the red and the blue here changing. So again, if I just start changing this, you can see that we're now adding some more red and the blue. So I'm going to try to balance these two out so they're equal. So you can see we have more red here than blue. So I'm going to go ahead and move this over here a little bit. And you can see now we're taking away blue. And there we go. Let me just pull it a little bit more. Yeah, okay. So now you can see now we have 0.3. Now it's too bluish. So we're going to pull it back. Let's go ahead and just kind of poke around. Now you can see we're balancing this out. So it's, we didn't do a chip chart or any grayscale card for white balance or anything like that. But again, it's just what we did. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of eyeball this with the temperature here. I'll try to get these values as close as I can. So it looks like 3300 is pretty close, as you can see. Let's go ahead and try 3200. That's probably about square. Yeah, let's go to 3300. See if that kind of balances out. So 1.3, 1.5, 3350. Let's try that. There we go. And that's pretty close. You can see the red and the blue. Again, this is averaging the information is about the same, and the green is pretty low. Okay, you can see right here. If I go ahead and hit the G channel, hit G, type in G here, you can see there's the actual luminance of the actual green. So I'll hit G again here, and now I can go ahead and take my exposure and kind of adjust it because I'm basically sort of white balancing at that case. So you can see I got a value of like 0.5 or 6. So each one of these is different. Like for instance, this here is one of my students, Sterling, who is volunteering time. You can see this is extremely warm. The same thing again, we're going to have to come in here and play with the exposure a little bit and then the temperature. So again, I'll put this to maybe 3200 as a good starting point. And again, I'll just scrub this area here. And then of course, you have very limited ability to increase shadows. So we'll get into that in a minute, but let's stick with Sterling here. And again, I can just sample this area and look at the bias between the red and the green channel, or red and the blue channel, I should say. And it's pretty spot on, 24, 25. So then I can take my exposure and bring it down, and now I get a nice 0.6, 0.5 value for the green, as you can see here. And if you want to see how things are going to key, you can go ahead and preview that by hitting the actual G key. So the G key is showing the green channel because we're going to be keying green. You can see as we start to bring up the exposure, bring down the exposure, you can see how this is starting to look like this, right? So it's going to be hard to key. We want to have that contrast between Sterling and the background. So you can see if I take the exposure up, and it starts working, you can see part of his highlights are starting to blend in here. So you can kind of pull this around as best as you can. You got to be careful though because of the luminance values, and you can see it kind of separating. That looks like the best separation there. Let's go ahead and take a look at what it looks like in general. And there you go. So let's go on to the third shot here, and I love this shot because it's so goofy. I'm going to put this to input here and scroll back. Hit the letter I, hit the letter O. Just scrub these guys to the sides, push them until they hit the wall. And I'm just going to go ahead and hit play. And here you can see this is one of my students. And she's throwing her hair all over the place, a little over the top for this whole scenario. You can see how we can have all types of issues in keying, and I try to make this as the most troublesome shots I can imagine for the sake for you guys for learning here. So one of the things is she's actually out of focus a little bit, so we're going to have to focus her up a little bit. You can see she's slightly blurry there. Her eyes are really kind of out of focus there. So the same thing again, I can just come in here and scrub this area. You can see the bias, we're a little bit too much red compared to the blue. So in that case, again, I can come here and let's dial this into, say, 2300 again. And okay, that's a little bit over the top. I'm going to start pulling this up to, say, 3500, 0.3, 0.7. Again, let's go ahead and dial it down. As we dial it down, it'll get more bluer. 33, 34. So these are pretty much balanced. And then the green, we can go ahead, take the exposure down a little bit. And you can see if I hit the green channel there, you can see that contrast between the colors there. So let's go ahead and kind of bring this down a little bit. Here we go. So now we got that going. Let's go ahead and pop over to this other shot here. And this is another example of things where you're going to have like messed up issues with shots. And you can see what we have is a flare coming in from the light that's in the back and to the left here. And you're getting this orange flare. In fact, if I zoom up on the image, this is not green at all. This is actually sort of a yellow-orange. So again, we can come in here and set this to 3200. There we go. And you also have the tint, which can adjust the difference between magenta and green. So if you want to increase green versus magenta, you can do that. In this case, we're balancing red, green, blue. And we can see that it's looking pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and bring down the exposure a little bit. There we go. The dynamic range in the Blackmagic 4K production camera, which is the older version, the dynamic range isn't the greatest. So you can see here, even in this overexposed area, the gradation from the highlights to the shadows is pretty rough, so to speak. It does give you a very nice image. It's a global shutter, so there's no issues in regards to rolling shutter, which would be problematic if you're doing tracking. But in general, this is a nice kind of starting point. Again, I'll look at the averages, 0.07, 0.1. So that tells me that there's a little bit too much blue in here. Let's try 3300. And now it's a little bit better. So yeah, there we go. And finally, I have this last shot. It's probably the most complicated shot, I'd say, because it's just all over the place. And again, we'll kind of start at 3200 here and go from there. There we go. And again, I'm going to go ahead and bring the exposure down because it was never meant to be exposed. That's what I love about RAW, the ability to kind of play with this. Now, you as a compositor would most likely get a DPX sequence. You wouldn't be getting a DNG sequence, which is basically straight from the camera. The editorial will give you a DPX sequence. And we'll probably have already done their own grading and set up their own LUT or lookup table to get the ball rolling here. As you can see, we have lots of motion blur. We have some tracking dots up here, lots going on here. So each one of these shots has different challenges. So Jack's challenge is going to be these little areas in his hair, through the glass. And then, of course, in this shot with Sterling, this is going to be an issue because he's crossing over into tracking points. We're going to have to reconstruct this area. So that's important to know. And here's a shot here with our actress, and you can see this hair is going to be a nightmare in regards to what is the best keyer to use. And again, some motion blur, a little bit of flare going on, and then here is a tracking shot, moving shot across our scene with, again, motion blur. So a lot of stuff to play with, and you can use this to build up your reel. I don't have any problem with that in regards to using this for your reel and so forth. So we're going to go through, and the first step of the process here is I want to go over image preparation for keying. Before we even do anything, we have to take the flawed, imperfect reality of what we shot and get it ready for what we would consider keying. So that's what we're going to do in the next lesson.